When we think of the conventional American horror movie, we typically associate all the tropes and cliches lampooned by Scream in the 90s, a film that sparked a new wave of genre self-awareness. But very little credit is ever given to one particular franchise that brought a level of relatively unfulfilled innovation to the genre as well. It may not have been the most polished or sophisticated series of films, but they still subverted the relationship between victim and killer in a unique way. This was Final Destination. I guess you could argue that Final Destination was once a blockbuster franchise within mainstream horror, long before companies like Blumhouse popularized the low-budget, low-risk business model that almost every modern horror film practically adheres to at this point. While some saw the series as little more than sensationalist popcorn-pleasing schlock, there were many that saw the inventive and clever concept behind it. It always had a very polarizing reputation, bar what was supposed to be the final film, The Final Destination, which attempted to cash in exclusively on the 3D craze that had re-emerged at the time, only to become the most visually obnoxious and conceptually boring film in the series, that was thankfully redeemed by the actual final film, which, critically speaking, had the best consensus overall, but that really isn't saying very much. It's no surprise the spec script for the original film by Jeffrey Reddick was developed for an X-Files episode, but once in the hands of New Line Cinema, producer Glenn Morgan and X-Files writer-director James Wong came onto the project and rewrote the script with emphasis on the film's trademark unseen villain and the philosophical undertones of death's inevitability. If you've never seen a Final Destination film before, the premise is always the same. A character witnesses a premonition of a fatal disaster and proceeds to panic and inadvertently pull several characters out of the event before it happens, meaning they survive the disaster but later become victims to random freak accidents. For the most part, they were largely self-aware films, toying with our anxiety over everyday dangers we're completely oblivious of. But the first film had enough subtleties to its execution that it balanced both relatively serious themes and being tongue-in-cheek in its sadistically violent nature. James Wong stated that Reddick's emphasis on the premonition is greatly inspired by the chaos theory of the butterfly effect with added consequences. Basically, if we don't consider our future to be predetermined, if something was to change in that path, it'll affect everything else that follows. In the case of these films, each character was supposed to die in the disaster but didn't, meaning their path has now changed. But since death is inescapable and inevitable, the motive of death as the film's literal villain is to correct the course and bring the characters back to their predetermined fate. You could say there is a mild trolley problem to it. In some way, the protagonist has the power to prevent or interfere with a devastating outcome, but nihilistically, it doesn't technically change anything as death will eventually find a way. More so, it adds a palpable sense of responsibility upon the innocuous protagonist, and the first film takes it to such an extent that it becomes a bit of a conspiracy thriller, in that the detectives start to suspect the protagonist is involved in the deaths, especially considering how each of them can be played off as accidents, whether intentional or not. I think of every death in the series, Todd's alleged suicide definitely hits the hardest, because it sets an extremely somber tone for the rest of the movie. His parents believe that he had a hard time coping with the loss of his friends, leaving our protagonist Alex feeling guilty of causing such pain, even though we know the truth behind it. It establishes this twisted, voyeuristic nature to the film, where we're spectators to death just going about its business while feeling helpless for each character. It's like Hitchcock's explanation of suspense using the bomb under the table. We know something bad is about to happen, unbeknownst to the characters, so it sets quite an emotionally intense playing field for things to come. Before films like Saw, this was the series that played on our morbid curiosity to see how each death happens, something that gets increasingly ridiculous as the series goes along. But how we get from this harrowing scene involving a likable character choking violently with his bloodshot eyes to some dude who gets his organs sucked out his ass via a pool drainage system kinda speaks for itself. Going back to the general philosophy of the film, the fact that the antagonist isn't a physical entity brings about our deepest, darkest fear. It's a villain that dominates and controls the fate of our existence. It's the very thing we dread the most. Death is just, well, death. Death is real, symbolic, incomprehensible, unpredictable, and most of all, unstoppable. It's the purest form of horror in any realm of fear. Granted, while we never see it, as they cut the idea from the original draft, it existing purely as a presence is enough to make for a perpetually existential premise. There is actual character given to it, of course. We can interpret it as both cunning and aggressive, driven by the sole desire to maintain its design. As a representative of the end, it programs exclusively to maintain and restore order. It's entirely a positive function when you think about it. These characters should be dead anyway, so it's fixing something that was previously broken. In fact, in the second film, Eugene tries to kill himself only for it to fail because it's not his turn to die in the order of death's list, thus insinuating that their lives are dictated by death. They don't get a choice in the matter. Death comes when death is ready.
I control my life, not you.
Carter!
I'm never gonna die.
But if we're getting into each film's alternate theory as to how to cheat or understand death, it gets surprisingly complicated because it's filled with countless contradictions. Which makes sense because, after all, none of us know death's design, and so everything the characters learn should be taken with a pinch of salt since so much advice proves to be wrong anyway. I mean, that's the real world for you. We don't know when our time will come. That's the mortality of our existence. Now, when you think about it too much, it does bring up a lot of questions. Specifically, where exactly did these premonitions come from when they all result in futile efforts anyway? You could also ask why the information keeps changing from film to film, but I think it's fair to assume that death can make up its own rules given the characters technically cheat death to begin with. However, while every character in this series does die, whether it be on-screen or off, there are two characters who have survived according to the theatrical canon. In the second film, Kimberly and Thomas are suggested to have been granted a new life, but their fates are still left completely ambiguous. In the third film's alternate version, there is a newspaper article that says they both fell into a wood chipper, but this isn't the original version, so it can be discounted, even if it does make all the films consistent. Additionally, there is one character shrouded in mystery who appears in several of the movies called William Bloodworth, and if that surname isn't on the nose enough for you, he's a mortician and funeral director with a distinct fascination in death. He's completely ambiguous to the story, but fans have always called attention to him as having some sort of connection with death, especially considering he lends his voice in other instances, so his presence is always there. He just screams Grim Reaper to me, or maybe he's a survivor, but either way, given he's the last character we see in the series, I like to think there's definitely sinister intent behind him. Before we end, I want to address the final film in the series because it has one of the most surprising twists that should be obvious, but admittedly I totally blanked on it during my initial viewing. The artistry of the first film is on point. There was a lot of attention to detail placed within it, such as production designer John Willett skewing the sets to create this unnatural feel to the film following the plane crash that sets the events in motion. Before the crash, the film looks and feels conventional with a brighter colour palette, and after the crash, things feel colder, more morbid, and generally uncomfortable. There's a real sense of menace and danger at every turn that really catches you off guard.
Then you can just drop fucking dead.
But Final Destination 5 totally subverts those expectations by effectively becoming a loose comedy. It would set up these elaborate obstacles to the point you're pretty confident you know what the outcome will be, before completely twisting itself into something more abrupt and absurd. Just take Isaac for example. It uses acupuncture to create a tense red herring, leads you to anticipate him being burnt alive, but nope, it's actually this stupid ornament very vaguely brought to your attention at the start of the scene. They're practically punchlines when you think about it, like Roy's death where you're just thinking, oh no, he's going to get impaled, but ooh, he's already dead. The film then throws this perfect franchise-ending mic drop. Throughout the film, you might notice everything looks late 90s, early 2000s in decor, clothing, and technology. It's easy to miss because the film never calls attention to it, but the biggest indicator is Isaac's phone. The reason for this is because once the characters think they've cheated death at the end of the film, they board a plane to Paris, and to our surprise, it's Flight 180, the very accident that established the first film, bringing everything full circle, and setting up a literal chain of events. Thinking about it, it's hard to believe the last film was over 7 years ago. Granted, it makes sense that they ended the series given it was a high-risk investment and never had the strongest following to begin with, but they were still all independently enjoyable in their own right, and most of all built upon a compelling premise that's so common in our innocuous lives. I think it's amazing how there's two ways to perceive these films: trashy, self-indulgent guilty pleasures, or well, trashy, self-aware guilty pleasures. I still feel the first film has the most merit to it for adding a supernatural quality to what were mostly a series of believable freak accidents. There was something rich buried within it that explored the dangers found in our everyday lives, and death's overriding power over humanity, a threat so ubiquitous and invincible that we need to accept it. It makes for a bleak reality, sure, but cinematically it creates a wild ride towards doom, whether you see it for the more serious moments or just the ridiculous mayhem. Overall, it's a series that isn't afraid to laugh straight in the face of death. Hi everyone, thank you so much for watching. Let me know in the comments below what your favourite Final Destination film is, or even what your favourite death scene is. I know my personal favourite is still the bus because it's the one that just catches you completely off guard. Until next time, if you enjoy what I do here and you want to support the channel, you can do so by heading over to Patreon, where you can get early access, vote on future videos, and if you're a $7 plus supporter, there is a bonus video on the way. And yeah, go follow me over on Instagram and Twitter especially. Talk to me over on Twitter. It's good to see people over there. And yeah, stay safe, and I'll see you all very soon for Halloween. Bye.